Staff and volunteers at the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum preserve our culture and connect us to our past. If you haven't been to the museum, please go. Amazing exhibits, wonderfully dedicated staff and volunteers. And the museum is open to the public with a limited schedule right now of Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 4, and it's free, our favorite price in the whole world. I'll put the URL. Well, once I've stopped talking, I'll put the URL in the chat so everybody can see. Our facilitator tonight is going to be Katie Curtis. Well, she's going to introduce the folks. She'll get things started. Katie is the community outreach manager at the Bainbridge Island Historical Museum, and she is the mover and shaker for these panels. She comes up with a lot of the ideas. She reaches out to our members of the community and gets them to come and share their knowledge with us. So I'm just so grateful to work with Katie, to work with the museum, and Inez and Arts and Humanities Bainbridge. They're both connected in the community. They're wonderful community partners. I can't say enough about them. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Katie Curtis.
Oh, John, thank you so much. It's always just so delightful. Such a pleasure to be here with you always. And we're so grateful to this partnership with the library, and we're partnering with Arts and Humanities Bainbridge tonight. Inez, it's wonderful to see you, and thank you. This was really your baby, this topic tonight, and so important, especially right now, courage in journalism. I always begin by wanting to read the land acknowledgement, so I'll do that now. Every part of this soil is sacred in the estimation of our people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain, and every grove has been hallowed by some sacred, happy, sad, or event in days long vanished. That was Chief Seattle. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is within the ancestral territory of the Suquamish people. Expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers. The Suquamish live in harmony with the Washington waterways along Washington Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish live and protected the lands and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. And what a wonderful blessing it is to be on this land. I'm so grateful. I am also so excited to be talking about courage in journalism and doing this particular program tonight. And I'm going to let our incredible panelists and our moderator introduce themselves. I do want everyone to know that we are going to try to get to your questions. And so Inez and I will be kind of watching the chat. If you want to put questions in the chat, that's fine. But I'm so excited about the panelists we have, but I want to introduce and thank Linda Jennings. Thank you so much for being here and being our moderator.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Katie. I'm just so excited about this program because often, you know, we journalists get a lot of grief these days. So it's nice to have a moment to talk about what journalism does well and the examples we've seen on the island. And of course, right now, if you're thinking about courage in journalism, you know, it's good to pause and think about the journalists in Ukraine, some of whom have already lost their lives. And they're there trying to tell us what's going on. And it reminds me how every day journalists around the world and in our community often put themselves at risk to inform us and keep us up to date on what's going on. And the dangers can be local. Maybe some of you remember over a year ago, Sarah Gensler, a reporter for The Olympian, was threatened by an armed individual while covering a demonstration at Olympia. So there's a lot going on that gives you pause and makes you think about how, our founding fathers, despite their own tangles with the broadsides of the day, they felt that a free press and an informed citizenry was essential to our democracy. And the Bainbridge Review has been a great example of speaking truth to power and really working to keep us an informed citizenry. And just as a little way of background, things have changed a lot. We're going to be talking about the 40s onward, and journalism has changed. The news industry is not what it used to be. Newsrooms across the country have shed more than half their employees since 2008. And some of those journalists were at newspapers that still publish, although with fewer pages and less news. But there's also been so many outlets that have closed. In 2020 alone, 300 US newspapers closed, and we're still counting the ones that closed during the pandemic. And it's left a lot of communities without a reliable source of local news. And there again, we are just so lucky to have the Bainbridge Review and still have a community news outlet that connects us, and one that has played such a pivotal role in the island's history. And so I want to briefly introduce the panelists who have all helped the Bainbridge Review play that role. And I'm going to start now and kind of go chronologically backwards, because then we're going to kick off from there. It will make sense once it happens. So Steve Powell, can wave his hand, is the current editor of Bainbridge Island Review and also the North Kitsap Herald and the Kingston Community News. A Washington State native, he graduated from Washington State University and began a 40-year career in journalism that's taken him to mostly daily newspapers all along the West Coast. It's hard to think of a place, just when we were chatting earlier, that Steve hasn't been. And then he's been mostly with weeklies for the past 8 years and has won more Washington Newspaper Publisher Association awards than anyone else during that time. But then at the age of 52, he earned his master's in education from PLU and taught for 3 years. But now he's back in the grind of journalism and is the current president of the Washington Newspaper Publishers Association, and certainly is confronting some very important issues in our community these days. And Becky Fox Marshall, wave Becky, spent 25 years in daily and community newspapers as a reporter, editor, photographer, columnist, and 11 of those were with Sound Publishing, including serving as editor of the Bainbridge Review and Central Kitsap Reporter. And she left journalism, much to the regret of journalism, in 2000 to the tech world, writing for Expedia, and then decided to work closer to home, and until recently, retired after 14 years with our wonderful Town and Country Markets, managing their website and social media. And her tenure at the Review, as you'll hear, was at a very fraught time. And Mary Woodward, who joins us from Yakima, hi Mary, is the daughter of famed Bainbridge Review editors Walt and Millie Woodward. And her debut book, which of course I picked up, In Defense of Our Neighbors, the Walt and Millie Woodward story, which came out in 2008, is a deeply personal account of her parents' lives and also an important record of local and American history. They were the owners of the Bainbridge Review and turned their newspaper, our community newspaper, into a voice for constitutional and human rights. They were the first newspaper publishers on the West Coast to condemn the forced internment of Bainbridge Islanders of Japanese ancestry during World War II. And so we want to turn to Mary now to share with us the courage in journalism that her parents faced and help fill us in on that chapter in history, which we'll talk about, don't want to forget. It's important to remember. Thank you, Mary, for joining us. If you'll unmute yourself, we'd love to hear you.
Linda, while she's looking,
There we go.
oh, there she goes. You need to introduce yourself too, Linda.
My name is Mary Woodward. I'm the youngest of 3 daughters of Millie and Walt Woodward. We grew up obviously on the island. My mother grew up on the island. She was born kitty corner to Wilkes School. And that was the place we always got our Christmas trees. We'd go there. There are many examples of courage on Bainbridge during the Second World War. And my parents were 2 of those who showed a lot of courage. I think perhaps this may be the most significant that they did. They stayed up all night, December 7th, and published on December 8th, the one and only extra in the review's history. And they did it for several reasons, I think. They wanted to show their support of the Japanese American community on the island. They wanted to inform people about civil defense and whether they should have their lights on at night or so there were many reasons for this, but it set the tone for the island and how they were going to deal with this, because my folks showed courage in that. They didn't intend to show courage. They wanted to do what was right for the island. That was how they approached their newspapering. And I have something I can read to you a little bit later that talks about that. How they faced things.
Thank you, Mary, and we're looking forward to hearing more. And as Katie pointed out, I forgot to introduce myself. One of the reasons I'm really enjoying this panel is that I'm fairly new to this wonderful island. I came here 5 years ago after teaching journalism at Georgetown and working for several national magazines. And since coming here, I'm on the board of Arts and Humanities with the fabulous Inez, and help with Currents, BainbridgeCurrents.com. And also I've been contributing to Yes Magazine and postalley.org while I'm out here. It's hard for a journalist to actually retire. But following the example of the Woodwards, who did face threats and some pushback for standing up for their Japanese American neighbors. In the 1990s, I guess it was 1991 mostly, I was really surprised to hear in a conversation with Robin Hunt a couple of years ago about what was happening here then and the role of the review in keeping hate out of our community. And Becky, I'd love to hear, I'm sure all of us would love to hear more about that now.
Thank you, Linda, and very honored to be here. Yeah, the 90s, in the early 90s, it started for me as this kid who lived in the woods who would bring in these rambling manifestos to the newspaper office, and every H was capitalized, and he had his pants tucked into his stormtrooper boots, and his head was shaved, and he was really trying to shock us and get coverage. And we actually didn't give him any publicity. And it was not long after that, he actually is now in prison for murdering someone in Olympia, a racially motivated murder. And then it wasn't too long after that, I was buying pumpkins at the grocery store, and there are these 2 fellows also looking at pumpkins, and they just gave me the creeps. And in the checkout stand, as luck would have it, an acquaintance of mine, I mentioned these two guys and how creepy they were, and he just whispered, "Call me." Well, he was living in a duplex, and these people had moved into the other half of the duplex, and they were nationally known members of a white supremacist group who were recruiting local youth, keeping them steeped in beer and this hate dogma. And it just never occurred to us not to cover it. It was different than the kid in the woods with his manifestos. These were people who were leaders in an organization that had done some really horrible things. And these people witnessed, encouraged, or committed some terrible, terrible crimes. And I worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Portland Oregonian and the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, Bill Wasmuth, who was such a treasure, and the local police. And it's strange because there was no internet, so which was a blessing and a curse, because we really wanted to put it in context and put it in, give it some, I don't know, it was more than a tweet, you know, I mean, it was really big stuff. These guys had, the Southern Poverty Law Center had sued Tom Metzger's group, which is where they came from, in Portland, when they killed an Ethiopian man. And it was the first trial of its kind in that this group was found liable for encouraging the violence. And they wiped them. It was a $12-something million settlement and wiped out the organization. And the people, that's where these people came from. So they dispersed, they ended up here. And it was a crazy time. I mean, it was very crazy.
Did you ever feel scared?
You know, I did, but I had covered, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, obviously, because of tonight, but the courage really came from the people who they were intimidating on Bainbridge. And courage I mean, I had covered crime, so I've been threatened by rapists and murderers and various people, but I didn't want to tip those guys off, so I didn't actually speak directly with anyone until like 24 hours before it went to press. And it was a Paulsbo resident who was supposedly associated with this group, although he denied it at the time. But he was pretty threatening. But my husband had covered a trial, the FBI, the Order trial on Whidbey Island, the FBI shootout. And the FBI had taught us how to look for bombs under the car. So we did. And, but they took off, you know, in the dead, literally under the cover of night. And really it was the community and the paper working together, I think, to expose everyone, to expose the activity that was going on that really caused them to leave.
And that really illustrates speaking truth and how it can make a difference, you know, engaging the community. And I heard about the march and the petition that everybody signed. And I hope we'll come back and hear more about that. And I don't know, Steve, if you've had any threats since taking over the review, but the challenges you must face today, trying to cover all the issues that are going on and the controversies that now I see the letters to the editor. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach these issues in our community today?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm humbled being on this panel. When John asked me to be on it, I didn't realize that, you know, two legendary journalists of the island would be on the panel with me. So I certainly, in the 2 years I've been here, haven't had, you know, any huge situations like that. threats are and criticism, they're just part of the job. I've dealt with it, like I said, almost for 40 years. And the topic courage in journalism was really interesting to me because I never really think of it as courage. I just feel like, doing the job, best our ability, can't be intimidated by people in the community. We have to cover these things, and I've never worked anywhere. This is my 6th newspaper in 4 years that's had a community so involved. Just amazing interest in the newspaper, and so I feel it's courageous every day just to put out a paper because
I was just gonna say what the real courage comes, Steve, when you misspell a high school student's name.
right? You spell millions of words right, but you get one wrong. And you
That's
hear
right.
A name, you get a name. Becky mentioned that they took courage from the community. They took courage from the people. And that's what my folks did. They didn't think of themselves as being courageous. They were just saying what they believed and what they felt the community believed. I don't know that they changed too many people's minds, but it gave Islanders who wanted to the opportunity to say, this is a terrible thing. We don't want our friends to be gone. And they spoke up like no other community. As a result of that, more people returned to Bainbridge than to other communities from the concentration camps.
And
They were welcomed.
I do want to say, I thought back through my career and I thought, well, when was really a time where I felt there was a situation that was really courageous? And of course, it wasn't in Bainbridge, but it's a great story. And you guys got to tell your great stories. So I'm going to tell mine. It was actually in Port Angeles about 20 years ago. And there was a doctor who delivered a baby that was probably going to die. And he actually pinched its nose and smothered the baby. And it created a huge uproar. In fact, I actually got to appear on a nationwide TV show at the time. But what made it really courageous, I felt in my mind, was this was a very beloved doctor in town. And he also went to my church. And I had interviewed his wife, who was a county commissioner. And so there's all this closeness. And you two know how you feel when you're in a community and you have to write something about some beloved people. I felt ostracized actually from my church. But it was something, obviously we had to write about it. So anyway, that was like my one courageous story.
That's pretty amazing. And you never know from day to day. That's part of the challenge and frankly, the excitement of being a journalist, that you never know what's going to come across that day. And it's 2 days are never alike. And one of the things, Mary, that struck me as I've started to learn about what your parents did, and I went to our wonderful historical museum and looked at the scrapbook that Paul Hodada had put together. And he was a high school boy, right, who was helping out at the paper after school. And when they were going to be forcibly sent to the internment camps, your parents, Mary, asked him to be a correspondent, and creating that bridge by having people in the camp tell of their lives in the review. I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and how that affected, as you said, more people returned to Bainbridge.
There was a communication all through the war from Manzanar and from Minidoka to Bainbridge Island. There was communication through letters. People actually the Rabers went to Montana to see the Kura boys, to see how they were doing. There was lots of stuff like that Islanders did to support their neighbors. And I forget, what was the question? Did you have?
Well, it was about the columns and how when you're, living here and you read about your former neighbors getting married or having a baby, that helped maintain and build bonds so that when people did return,
Mhm.
they were part of the community. And I just thought that was such foresight.
That is one thing that both of my parents had in abundance. They could, I couldn't do it, but they could see what the result of actions was going to be. And I'm very impressed by that. I don't know how much courage that showed, but it was remarkable that they could. Well, one of the reasons they hired Paul Otake was because they needed to have a record. He said, "Oh, can't find it in here." There was a exchange of letters between my parents and Paul Otake. And he said, he was very shy and he didn't want to do it. And my father wrote back a rather stern letter to him saying, your people are going to want to come home at the end of the war, and they're going to be welcomed by most of us, but there'll be some who make a stink, but that won't be as obvious if you weren't sending in these weekly reports that humanized the people. And when a baby was born, it was just as important on the island as it was in, say, Minidoka.
And that's really key, being able to make those kinds of connections, because there was a lot of discrimination after the war that was ongoing. There were places that put up signs, but overall, from what I've heard, people on Bainbridge were welcomed back, but there was also a silence. And all of you editors may have confronted that, how you break silence when I remember talking with Gina Corpez about the Indopino and Filipino American community and the silence that she talks about in her film, Honor Thy Mother. But part of the courage of journalism can be piercing that silence so people do talk about this important history. Was it in the 90s when you were the editor, Becky, that one of the controversies was school curriculum? As finally this was getting taught in schools, there was real pushback, right?
Yeah, there was there was a person actually who was I don't know. There were times when I felt like he just held the island hostage, and he objected to. I barely remember it, but there was, I think there was an injunction against him at the school grounds because he was so disruptive. But yeah, he objected to the curriculum.
Yeah,
It's
he
like-
objected to the Sakai wonderful program on the exclusion and the Sakai's role in it. And both he and his wife, I mean, they were finally ejected by the sheriff's department, came to get them from one of the elementary schools on the island that they wanted to.
Yeah.
And that brings us forward to something that, Steve, you're seeing today. I've seen some of the letters to the editor. The question of critical race theory and teaching about diversity and equity has become a pretty, it's not embraced by everyone on Bainbridge. And how do you cover that or deal with those issues?
Well, I know I'm sure learning a lot personally from the BLM movement, and now I've been around for a while, right? And over the years, I thought, hey, things have really improved. It just seems like, racism, there's just not as much of it, right? And boy, when these protests came out and we started covering and talking to folks, I was amazed, the way that people were still being treated. And I thought, oh God, that's like over a long time ago. So I was very ignorant about it. And so I'm glad that these stories that were being kept secret, I guess, are now coming out, and people realizing just how unfair things still are, and so I think, in a way, the media hasn't been doing its job letting letting the communities know this is still going on. We need to work harder at this, and yeah, it's kind of.
You did run a good.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, but you did run a story, for example, when a couple of months ago, somebody defaced one of our public art in Waterfront Park with a swastika.
Right.
So, yeah, it's not all ancient history. And
Oh.
it raises Mary?
Well, I was just going to say, no, it's not. I mean, you just have to look at Europe.
Yeah, and one of the questions that it brings me to is when I started out as a young journalist and I worked for the AP and Associated Press, and everything was about objectivity, giving equal time to both sides of any issue you talk to. And I'm just wondering what you each think about, when does journalism better serve a community by taking a stand? When we talk about fairness and giving all sides a voice, is there the risk of falling into the trap of false equivalency? I mean, Becky, you made some decisions about what to publish and what not.
Yeah, I think the false equivalency epidemic is upon us. But I think that I hope that people are starting to question it. I think I read some journalism professor actually said, this is so ridiculous. Like, if you cover something about an African-American person, are you supposed to call the KKK? I mean, it's ridiculous, because there are some things that are just right on the face of it. And part of the tone, as Mary said, that Walt set for the island during that time, he set for the paper forever. And there was no question that the paper, Walt was writing a column for us at the time. And there was no way we were not going to cover something like this. And that pressure is now on you, Steve. So, it's knowing your history is so important, because it can determine your future.
That's great. And Mary, maybe you could talk also a little bit about that, and about the difference between editorials, opinion, and the news stories.
That came to mind earlier in your discussion. Yeah, there's a marked difference between being as objective as you can be in a newspaper report of something that happened, and your opinion about what happened. And my folks used that. They both had columns. They expressed themselves there, but mostly in the editorials that they wrote. And that was one of the first things that they did in that extra edition of the review. They came out and said, this is wrong. We have neighbors. This is wrong.
And I think also what's changed is that in that time and in the 90s, people didn't question your motives if you were a journalist. And now that's not true anymore. And I think that's it requires even more courage now.
Yeah.
And the internet, the harassment and threats that journalists can face on the internet. I have friends who get these horrible social media attacks threatening to rape them and tear them apart, and they've had to shut down accounts, and it's a whole other level of intimidation and threat that journalists face. And it brings me kind of around to the question of what can we do to rebuild the trust? You know, at the time of your parents, Mary, I think everybody did trust, or most people did, the local news. And there's been study after study. If anybody wants to go to the Pew Research site, for example, you can see the studies about the trust in news. And it's something journalists talk about a lot. And there have been various initiatives. And I'm just really interested in what you each think, because how can you do that important reporting, standing up to hate and to discrimination, if you don't have trust? So, like Steve, what do you do in terms of building that trust with the community?
Well, what I try to do, and I've actually got a lot of nice comments from the community, especially in the first 6 months I was here, is frankly to write objectively. I guess a lot of folks thought the previous editor slanted a lot of stories, and I actually know the previous editor. He worked for me in Everett years ago. But I think people see so much information in so many different areas, social media, and there's so much bias everywhere, that I try to give them a fresh breath of air by reading a newspaper that doesn't have a whole lot of bias in it. And and the opinions that I do show is on the editorial page, which, and frankly, I'm not really, it's not really a focus of mine to have the editorial page. I mean, we've got a small staff, and we're supposed to write stories about the community, right? But once in a while, there's something comes along that I really feel I need to speak about. But yeah, opinions I keep on the editorial page, and stories I try to give. I like what you're saying earlier. You don't want to like be ridiculous and get, you know, KKK or whatever, but within reason, try to inform people as well I can on the whole issue. Yeah.
And Becky, could you elaborate a little bit? I mean, maintaining and building trust at that time of handbills of hate must have been a challenge.
You know, I was just thinking that actually it was more challenging when Port Blakely Mill Company wanted to build a huge development here. That and annexation, those two things really split the community. And but there was no question that no one spoke on behalf of the white supremacist groups. So there was no problem with trust during that.
I wonder if the exit of Trump, I hope, will have an effect on that. I mean, there were so many lies that covered all aspects. With that gone, do you think people will go back to trusting our journalists? No.
I don't know, because there's a legitimate issue with so-called fake news. I mean, coming out of Ukraine, there's been examples of how photos are doctored. And actually, it was here at our library. There was a program on fake news back in the summer of 17 or 18 in the Library U. And one of the speakers illustrated how you can change a photo to be something completely different. He used an example. It was Michelle Obama that had been holding a card that probably said something like, you know, eat your veggies. And it was changed to the card to say something like, well, something hateful. And the speaker illustrated how you can examine something like that to know that it was altered. And the question of sharing, that you don't share on your social media something that you haven't vetted, which is a real issue. And it's true, though, that the research I've seen, while there's a lot of mistrust of the news, of journalism, people still trust their local paper. And, you know, why? They might not trust what they see in the national news. And of course, a lot of people get their news from Facebook or TikTok. But what is it about the local community papers like the Review that allows that kind of trust?
You know who your editor is, and your editor knows who you are. That's what happened on Bainbridge. I mean, my parents reflected the island.
And Becky?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, when I got my journalism degree, All the President's Men was the #1 bestseller. And journalism was rated the most noble occupation. And by the time I left journalism, it was down with used car salespeople. And I apologize to any used car salespeople. But
And lawyers.
I mean, the trust is culturally degraded. And it started before the former president. And then we just became the enemy of the people, which didn't help. But I think local journalism is the same, is what Mary was saying. They see you at the store. They see you at school with the
I don't
kids.
know if I want you to quote me on this, but my father did say at one point, I'm not so sure about those Southern California Japanese, but the Bainbridge Island ones are more.
Well, and when we look at history, journalism has not always been a shining example of speaking truth to power. And going back to World War II and the forced exclusion, the Hearst chain, McClatchy chain, they were stirring up anti-Japanese American sentiment actively.
It was horrible. It was horrible. They were manufacturing submarines that were off the coast of Oregon. It was horrible. Henry McLemore.
Do you want to tell us, for those who might not know, about Henry McLemore?
Oh, I have to find this quote here because it's absolutely wonderful. Henry McLemore, well, he was in the Seattle Times, so who did he work for? Anyway, he was syndicated and from California, and he was very, very anti. He said at one point, I hate all Japanese, and that means all of them. And he was just, oh, I should be more organized here. Maybe I'll find it later. But my father says something to the effect that Henry McLemore, with all the intelligence of a blind pig, has said this. And he did attack McLemore in a couple of columns.
And while you're looking for that, I mean, there were those national columnists who were very influential. And, you know, I guess what I'm referring to is the days of what was called yellow journalism.
Mhm.
And
Well, I think Henry McLemore belongs in that. That's just me. But yes, there were many others out of the South. There were particularly supporting politicians in the South who wanted to get rid of the Japanese. I don't know what I was going to say.
well, and if you want to look up that passage you were looking for in your book about McLemore, but yes, there were also newspapers in the segregated Jim Crow South that were basically complicit in what was going on. So, you know, we do have to share that there's that dark side to the history of journalism. But that's why it stands out all the more, the courageous stands and reporting that the.
No, I never thought of parents as courageous, and our dinner table conversations they weren't beating a drum or saying, aren't we wonderful? You know, we just talked about the events that happened. And actually, I thought everybody on the island knew the exclusion had happened, but they didn't, because they didn't talk about it.
And which brings us, I mentioned earlier, I hadn't known about the white supremacist efforts to infiltrate that Becky was telling us about. And what can we do, or should we be doing, to make sure that episodes of history aren't forgotten or glossed over? And actually, maybe Katie wants to jump in because the museum plays a role in this too.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that it's very important. When one of the things when I talked to Becky, when we were organizing this, she was really investigating reporter, right? And so having that opportunity to really have reporters look for all of the objective facts and all of that kind of thing, I think is really important. And, we are working really hard at the museum to decolonize the museum because museums are, just as bad as any institution perpetuating, white supremacy and white supremacist culture. And no matter how inadvertent that is, it takes work, to look and see and try to think who is missing and then to reach out. So, for example, the museum has reached out to people in different communities and have hired advisors from different communities. And so it's just very, very important. And it's important to think about the filter that we're listening to people so that we believe people, even if they give us a story that doesn't fit what the dominant culture has given us. I think that's really important too. And it is 10 minutes till the end. And I'm just so excited. I just want this to continue. And somebody asked, has this conversation happened before? Well, this particular one has not. It's part of a series that John and I have been doing for many years with the library and the historical museum. But I just want to let folks know that if you do like what you're hearing and you feel like there's more that you want to hear, definitely pick up your laptop and send some emails to Inez at Arts and Humanities Bainbridge or the library or the historical museum so we can continue these. I haven't seen many questions. I didn't know if anybody had any questions. Inez, have you been watching to see, is there a question that you have?
Just some comments, no questions yet.
I have a question. Do you, this wonderful panel, do you have examples of courageous journalists today?
I think we do. Certainly those that are covering the war in Ukraine, but also the investigative reporting that's still being done at a lot of outlets around the country. And it's still a lot about speaking truth to power. And there are some awards given out every year by the International Women's Media Foundation that's global to women journalists who exemplify courage in journalism. And we're talking about, I remember meeting a woman from Romania, and acid was thrown in her face because she was trying to write about local organized crime. And other women and other journalists who face incredible threats to try and get the news out. And something that Katie mentioned, I wanted to follow up on, and that was, decolonizing the museum. There's an ongoing effort, which frankly so far usually falls short, by news organizations to become more diverse themselves in their own staff, and also to bring more diverse voices to their coverage. There are so many communities that historically, unfortunately, newspapers and other news outlets have not given them a voice. They've been overlooked and underserved. And one thing that some outlets do is a source census, where you actually take your publication and look at who are the sources, who are the people you're interviewing. Are they really representative of the world around you? Or are they just people that look like you? And we have a lot more work to do there. And one positive example, Yes Magazine, which you know was founded on Bainbridge Island. One of the editors several years ago, Tracy, when I first met her, they turned their staff around to be majority minority within a couple of years as a very intentional effort. But as I say, if you look at the numbers, we still have a lot of work to do. So I wanted, before we go to what hopefully are some questions and comments, to see whether each of you have something you want to add that we haven't touched on, or something you want. Becky?
Well, I was looking at this great question from Linda. Are there times when you as journalists worry about giving voice to folks who are trying to terrorize others? That is such a great question. And when the white supremacists were here, the other editors of the other Kitsap newspaper were not interested in the coverage. And that was there. And I think it was because they thought they were so fringe that why give them column inches, which I understand, because I think that, and I'd love to hear Steve's response, because I think that is a constant question, like, should these people get coverage? But there's also, shedding light. I mean, the white supremacist group had to be covered because all the light would make them shrivel up. The lone kid living in the woods who was just trying to scare the newspaper office I felt should not get any publicity because of that very reason. But so yes, it is a constant battle, I think. Steve?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I do think, I do try to be objective and get a lot of sources. And the only way, I guess, you learn about how horrible an organization is if you know some information about them, So I think it's important to inform the public somehow about, these hate groups. So we know, make sure you talk to your kids. Don't get involved with anybody who speaks like this or things like that, And so, yeah, I understand the feeling of not wanting to give them any publicity at all, but how do we know that they're bad if we don't tell people about it, I guess? We got to inform people. Yeah.
And Mary, do you want to address that a little bit? Like at the time, whether your parents spoke about whether they should also be interviewing the people that agreed with the forced evacuation?
I don't know that they ever did that. I'm thinking back on articles that I've read. They did do extensive interviews within the Japanese community, but other than two things that they did right from the beginning was to open up what they called the open forum, which was letters to the editor. And that was really encouraged. And many people used that. Actually, the island was communicating with itself.
Is there anything else, Mary, that you wanted to add that we haven't covered before we see if there are more questions?
No, I can't think of anything, although I would encourage islanders to learn about the story, either at the museum. There's an interesting book that I wrote that has information on this. I would encourage people to know. It was such an important part of Bainbridge Island history, and it wasn't talked about because of the letter that was sent in the 1980s, letters from three presidents sent letters and said, we were wrong. We should never have done it. And Kana Cow, some of you may know her, said, well, when we read that, then we knew we weren't going to be accused of whatever and sent away again. That was a real fear for those people for what, 40 years.
Thank you, Mary. I just, sorry to interrupt, Linda. I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that that reconciliation part, is so important. And then to hear that when there is an apology like that, then that is also ways in which we can hear the stories that haven't been shared before.
Can I interject about the Schuyler's?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll try to make this short. I was in school with a wonderful young man, Ethan Schuyler, and he grew up on the island. And his father was very prolific author. He wrote, he was brilliant. He wrote about economics and apparently was quite brilliant. But he also wrote about how we ought to send all the Japanese to an island in the Pacific, and probably the Jap lovers too, like the Woodwards. It was just a nasty, nasty organization.
And we still have a lot of nasty organizations around today. And as Becky said, shining a light on them. At the same time, there is that question of, do you give publicity to, it's just a couple of people and they're really a fringe group and don't have a following? Are you giving them a platform by writing about them? I think that's something journalists wrestle with all the time, because there's, it's not an easy.
But do they have an obligation to tell what has happened in the community so people can make up their own minds?
Exactly.
Yeah.
One trick I use, and I think all the journalists use, is like if you think they're a little bit off base, you might just give them a little bit at the end of your story, but at least you get that perspective in there, and you don't, it's not the big headline and big expose on the, the horrible group that wants to come to town. It's, yeah.
Well, I have, I'm going to interrupt because we wrap these up at 8 o'clock. And so I want to thank everyone and let you know that John and I have a tradition where we cannot kick people off. But these are 1 hour programs. And so what we do is we kind of do a little wrap up, and then we stop the recording. And then if you want to hang out with us and finish up the conversation and that kind of thing, then you're welcome to do that. So I just want to thank Linda. What a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful program this was. Thank you for your very thoughtful preparation and moderation. And it was just fantastic. I feel like we just scratched the surface hearing, from Becky and hearing from Steve. It's great to have your face out here, Steve, so we do know our editor and what you look like. And it's just been, of course, Mary, it's always such a treat to see you. And I will plug that Mary will be at the Historical Museum from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in a week on March 30th, signing her books, if anyone wants to come and meet Mary. And Inez, thank you so much for this brilliant idea.